Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Dev Different podcast. I'm excited for this one. We have a multifaceted guest on today, design pro, sponsored professional athlete, runner, Austin
we'll say that.
transplant, Ross Brown. Ross, how's it going?
Yo, what's up? Good to see you. Good to be here.
And I guess I should mention, too, the owner and the guy responsible for all of the visual presence of CodeBuddy. So Ross is our
brand, design, product design, you name it. It's all under that same roof.
Awesome. Well, yeah, we've got a lot to talk about today. We've had kind of some fun things going on in the product development world within CodeBuddy. But before we do that, I kind of want to take, we have a lot of developers and kind of software adjacent people, or even, we had a guy, AI ethicist, PhD last week, but we haven't had a, kind of pure design personality on the podcast in a while, probably since the last time you were on. But, you and I have always kind of gotten along in the, at least I'm a hobbyist UX kind of person. I'm always looking at different product designs, physical and otherwise. And, I have never been formally trained in design, but I do have a passion for it. And I think it's something that, is becoming increasingly more important, paradoxically, as AI becomes more proficient or, prolific. But I really wanted to take a step back and get your thoughts. So 2 questions to kind of start off the podcast. What is design from your perspective? And why is it that you love it? Or what drew you to it?
Yeah, so coming in hot with that first question, that's a big one. I would almost even counter back to you, not to answer a question with a question, but like cliche as it sounds, what isn't design? There's like everything that we experience in our world to an extent in some way, shape, or form has been designed, whether it was intentionally or unintentionally or just like the way we experience life when you get out of bed in the morning and you go to brush your teeth. I mean, I'm a Sonicare guy, not that we're like, brand sponsorships or whatever. Shout out to Sonicare, I guess, though.
Yeah, sponsor us if you want. We'll take it. I am as well.
Sure.
So I buy the off-brand.
I guess it's Philips. Is it still Philips?
I think so, yeah.
Sonicare? That's like the brand. But yeah, I mean, that's been designed, and the experience of brushing your teeth in the morning, there's design to that. As far as it relates to us, like we're more focused on like the digital experience and software design. But I guess, and all that entails is, components, different like UI, UX, like interfaces. You're looking at different devices, different screens. All those things kind of come together to make that, bigger picture. It's funny, I know you and I have just been recently working on this together, but the idea of just kind of like getting components to be designed out in whatever state or status that they could possibly like render as. I guess the best way to answer this question, if I'm ultimately arriving here, is design is the consideration of all possible outcomes to an extent and making sure that you're being intentional about what those outcomes are and planning for the best, ultimately. And you can do that in big ways or small ways. And I think, we talk about a lot about like the idea of like Brad Frost's like atomic design principles. Like ultimately, like we are all made up of, smaller pieces of our own like biology. And I think the world around us obviously is as well. And whether those are like organic things or digital products or, man-made things, like we're all just like pieces of a whole. So I don't know. I think that is maybe getting into the second part of your question and answering that. And I think that has always fascinated me in terms of just like, how do we experience the world around us, whether it's, man-made or not. And so being able to have a say in that and like doing things that ultimately inform like best practices for the rest of humanity, I think is really interesting.
Very cool. And yeah, like give me a little bit of your background or give the listeners a little bit of your background on, what kind of drew you to a career in design and, how has that looked thus far?
Yeah, I think I started from a pretty early age. My dad actually was a very old school traditional illustrator. So he actually was a freelancer, but big list of clients, namely Disney was his biggest one. And so I kind of grew up with him just like having a home studio where I would be kind of rolling around doing whatever, playing and getting into, you know, are we vulgar on this? Can I say?
Yeah.
Getting into some shit,
Yeah,
as
absolutely.
a kid.
Oh,
And yeah, just would kind of cruise around and he's painting Mickey Mouse or, Pluto or whatever. And I think that was like always something that just like kind of hooked me, obviously from an early age, like grew up drawing, grew up doing all that. And then interestingly enough, like I feel like, in the 90s, I'm a little older, so I'll date myself a little bit, but into the 90s and like early 2000s was when I was like kind of coming out of high school, getting into like college, doing kind of that whole path. That was like, I think you could argue that like it's been an exponential thing since then, but like as kind of like early, adoption of like Photoshop and like software tools that are like built specifically for design started to kind of take off, like that was when I was really kind of exploring a lot of that. And funny enough, because it's like, I guess bittersweet in a way that I was able to adopt a lot of those tools, but like that was actually something that probably like helped my dad, form more of an early retirement than he even wanted to, because he just didn't want to like pick up those tools and make sure that, he knew inside and out like the best way to use Adobe Illustrator. He would rather just like take a piece of illustration board and a paintbrush and do his thing. So I don't know. I think that was always like something that was fascinating, just to be able to like learn the new tools. And again, like I said, it's been very exponential since then that we have so many new tools that are being authored almost every single day in that space. So but yeah, my background kind of started there. Ended up being a graphic design major through school. Actually, it was an art major, so I had to do painting, printmaking, photography. Like we had to process our own film and go into the black room, dark room. What's it called? Dark room. I mean, every single medium, like on a fundamental like basis, I pretty much touched. And then obviously, yeah, like the aforementioned, just like digital tools that were there at the time, and graphic design being, a perfect medium for a lot of those, or, kind of like point of view for a lot of those, really hooked me. So kind of grew up doing that, and then fell into the world of like web dev and front end dev, because ultimately all designs need to, or, digital designs were kind of looking for like homes, and web design was obviously a huge thing. And, it was just kind of trying to follow the medium and, do my best to keep up. So here we are.
yeah. And it's actually a really good segue. It's interesting. You talk about your dad and how he had like kind of a medium, right? And that was his thing. And like, and was he airbrushing, or was it like physical?
Yeah, he would. So
brushes.
He
like
was
painting?
he was drawing, like pencil sketches. He would get it depended on the client and like their process, obviously. But the ultimate output was illustration board. He would take whatever composition either he had come up with, or the art director had come up with. He would be drawing those onto the board, like just essentially transferring. And then acrylic paint, and he had an airbrush, and it was, magic. Honestly, for me growing up, like to be able to see that come together was really fascinating.
Yeah. So there was that medium, and then there, obviously since, as you mentioned, has been kind of a switch into another medium in which designers do their work. Something like Photoshop, Illustrator, Figma, obviously being in the software world the kind of predominant player right now. But it kind of leads into our next kind of topic of conversation, which is, there's this thing called AI, right? It's kind of been
Heard of that.
making a few headlines in some niche publications. And from the dev world, building with the tools that we're building, our internal, currently internal, it's about to be released for public beta here by the end of the year. But our code generation tool has kind of fundamentally changed the medium in which I do my work, right? So 4 years ago, I sit down to do a day of development, and I would do that in Visual Studio almost exclusively, right? Plus, like, our tool contains like internet searching, things like that. So I guess I would use Visual Studio and Google Chrome and things like that. But today, after taking like a first principles approach to like what is software development and really trying to boil down that experience of building software to, keeping the human making the essential decisions, the decisions that represent the essence of software development, while also enabling them to offload pieces that maybe are lower leverage or kind of like we had somebody determine, call them like grunt work. It's pretty fundamentally changed the way that I do my work, right? And I'm still building software. I'm still a software engineer, but the tool set, the medium has changed as happens. And so I guess my question to you, or kind of what I wanted to
I have a thought.
Yeah,
if you
yeah.
don't mind, I might just tip in and interject. I mean, you think about everything you were just saying there, adapt that to our waking up and brushing your teeth analogy for like 2 minutes ago. A toothbrush that essentially will brush your teeth for you because you don't want to like do that motion. Like that is taking the grunt work away. That is an evolution of how things, should be, for lack of a better way of saying it. And I think that connection is like a really interesting one to kind of keep in mind as we keep having this conversation. So
yeah, and then there's
say that and
even in the toothbrushing world, there's now even the one I saw this the other day, and I was like, okay, as a product guy, I kind of appreciate this if it works. It's like shaped almost like a mouth guard sort of deal that you basically bite down on this thing and you turn it on and it brushes all of your teeth at one time. So it's like there's your second evolution on, we probably wouldn't have gotten there if somebody hadn't done the electric toothbrush.
Yeah,
because then
absolutely.
Like, oh yeah, how can we iterate on this? But to get back to my question, I think it would be naive to say that design is something that, and it's easy to, right? To say that like, oh, design's visual, like large language models spit out text, right? And so when the first time we got it to spit out code, then all of a sudden you go to like, ooh, coders, like it's coming for your job, and which is, I don't agree with, but it's easy on like kind of the design side of the house because it's visual in nature, right? And because like you can't ask ChatGPT to spit you out a beautiful mock-up and it will do it. Like a lot of people just kind of, write off AI's ability to be a foundational kind of transformation in the design world. But some of the stuff that we've been doing shows pretty much exactly the opposite. So I just kind of wanted to like talk that through with you and the listeners, or for the listeners, so that, just how does that look today, or what things do you foresee being what grunt work, first of all, do you see in the design process that might be able to be, automated by AI? And what is the kind of essence of design that still remains like a largely or, completely human pursuit?
That's a really good question. And I think it can kind of branch into two different paths to, I guess be those respective answers. Things that kind of are there and are, I think, ripe for opportunity as far as like automation goes and getting rid of some of that grunt work. And you're already seeing this a lot. Like we've got like, I know Figma kind of like launched and then shut down like the whole like AI like generative, like mock-ups or screens. But I think like stuff like that where it's like the way I'll separate this is like your information layer and your like branded or like storytelling layer, which are two totally different things. And ultimately, like you probably should answer the first. And this is kind of getting to like, I think some of the conversation we've had.
Break that down for me, or for the listeners, like the information layer versus the story.
Yeah, it'd be like the way I almost have learned it, or it's been broken down for me. And I think these things have been completely muddied over the years with just industry terminology, but like the difference between UX and UI. Your experience, as far as I'm concerned, is that like information layer where it's like, that on an authorization or login screen, you're going to put your information in, whether that's like username, password, connect with Google, whatever. And then you're going to see some sort of like dashboard. And then on that dashboard, depending on the app or use case or whatever, you're going to see all these different tools and things available to you. Like that, like user flow of like step 1, step 2, step 3. Like I want to buy this t-shirt. I'm on the view product page. I add it to cart. Maybe I'm presented with a little preview of my cart. I can just like do that. Or maybe I even, if like Amazon pioneered this, they'll like just buy it now. Like I don't need a second step. That is like your experience layer, as far as I've been concerned. The branded layer, or like the storytelling layer, sits on top of that, is equally as important. But that's one where, you know, color palette, typography, spacing, negative space, generally just like the feeling or vibe that you get. You know, it's like that's a very emotional thing. You know, and there are brands that spend millions of dollars a year on just that, and like making sure that when someone sees or experiences their name or product or whatever, that they feel something in a certain way. I don't know. Hopefully that answers the question as far as like,
no, absolutely.
You know, which of those layers there are. But getting back, I guess, to the original question, like I think there are opportunities for automation within both, but I feel like lately I've seen more opportunity in that kind of like design of the information layer, where, you know, you like, I use like the login screen as an example, like to a certain extent, until there's like a totally new paradigm. A login is a login is a login. And like, that's a sort of like bit of grunt work as far as like a visual component that you could have, whether it's the actual like sign in button or the form input or whatever. Like those are pieces of a whole that come together to be that login screen. And those individual pieces can be automated in a way where you're outputting something that has a pretty similar functionality, and like, you know, a button's going to have like a hover state and a click state, and if it's a link, it's like a link you've already visited state. Like that kind of stuff is like very basic and very easy, I think, to automate. I think on top of that, though, like there's a little more opportunity to, like when you talk about like what is design, like the concept of what a login screen is, you know, and I think you could use, I guess we're just going to kind of keep rolling with this analogy, but it's like when Apple released like Touch ID or now Face ID, like that was like a different means to the same end. And that experience is completely different. You don't have to touch or I guess Touch ID is obviously you're touching the like ID pad, but like Face ID, you don't have to do anything. It's like maybe a swipe up to make sure you're, you know, triggering it. But like outside of that, it's like those are the things where I think humans are always going to need to be innovative in that way. And we will all, like, whatever the output is of that experience can be automated in like certain ways, you know, but the ultimate innovation of like, this is something that I think we as, you know, a society or humanity like will benefit from, like an easier way to do X, Y, or Z, like that's never going to go away. And like ultimately, like if you're innovative and thinking, you know, in innovative ways about the future, and like trying to be a little bit more like focused on just like what's next, like you're always going to have a job. You're always going to like the tools will change, but you're always going to, like, we always need people to help solve problems that, like, you know, and there's a bigger conversation there around just like the world as a whole, and whether you subscribe to like climate change and things like that. But it's like we're going to need human solutions to some of these possibly like human caused like problems. So like a need for like just like problem solving is always going to be there.
Yeah, for sure. It's super well said. And like, you know, to analogize it to the software world, like, yeah, I mean, I don't write a lot of code manually anymore, because I am able to, you know, with the correct context and the correct scoping, I'm able to say, I want a method that does this, and it does it, right? And so it's like, well, I'm not coding anymore, but it's like, what is coding? What is software engineering? And like, it's the same thing as like, you know, it takes innovation to move from login to Touch ID. It's the same way in terms of like, what are you actually building in terms of software, right? Like the race is going to increasingly become less about who can build the fastest that whatever thing, and it's going to become about who can design the best thing, because the building, the implementation of it,
1,000,000%,
is going to, kind of go to zero or trend towards zero in terms of time, money, energy, whatever. But it's that, it's still that, like,
if I may, you think about, like, just historically, like, when blogs were taking off, I feel like this podcast is making me sound awful old. What did I reference? Like early days of Photoshop, and now I'm talking about blogs.
Yeah,
man.
They're coming back, by the way.
Yeah, I mean they're a thing. That's like a omnipresent, just life thing now.
The CTO of Uptrends AI and I are jumping on a personal blog bandwagon. I'm gonna have a sweet blog coming up here soon.
But like, I guess the greater point there being is like everyone had a blog. Like it got to a point where there's that, like, you've hit that saturation point. But like the best ones were the ones that had really interesting thoughts and content, obviously, and even better if they were like well designed and easy to use and experience. Like people are going to keep coming back for that, and like, I guess to even just almost rewind that for a step, like even if they weren't very good looking or easy to use, if the thought, like, content was there, and like the thought leadership and just like provoking of ideas and just like, innovating in terms of like what's next, to be able to share that, people will still find that way more interesting. And that gets back to the kind of that information layer versus like the kind of like branded or like, storytelling layer.
I love podcasting, because you just get to go into these deep conversations.
It's like
you don't get to have anywhere else.
Yeah, and we've talked about this too. Like, I'll keep throwing out old analogies. Like the iPod wasn't the very first MP3 player. Like we all know
Alternating current, brought to you by Necklace.
But yeah, ultimately, it's like you don't have to be the first to do something. You have to be the best. And there's a lot that goes into that. But like ultimately, it's like, is it easy to use, and is it something that people find some sort of connection with on, like, hopefully like an emotional level. So
we've also been cooking up here at CodeBuddy some methodologies, tooling, some AI modeling around a radically different paradigm for specifically the UI design of software. We've kind of spitballed around ideas, retrospective design, or almost continuous design. But let's talk about this for a second. So, again, let's go to the pre-adoption of AI days, where you and I actually worked at the same time for a brief period at the Arbor Day Foundation, right?
Yeah, go plant a tree.
Yeah, many days ago, not that long ago. But, the status quo was at the time, if we're going to build a new feature, right? So I think you and I worked on I think there was a feature about like a coffee club membership checkout, right?
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
People could subscribe to this service and get like different combinations of coffees and stuff. So,
yes. Like a subscription.
Yep. And so we had to build a thing that allowed a user to do that. And there was a lot of like sub options, and like, do you want ground or not? And do you want decaf, and how often? And I think whatever, lots of options. And so, we had to do that feature. And the way that you did it at the time was we got together, we met for probably like an hour, and like just talked about all the different things that are going on. It's like, okay, what are the options? We maybe did some flow charting, we did some whiteboarding.
And a lot of that's obviously driven by like sorry to jump in, but a lot of that's driven by just like the business need itself, who's running that program, what are our actual like, operations like within that, and obviously limitations within like shipping and all that stuff too. So laying it all out there.
So we sat down, we hashed it all out. We tried to write out everything basically, and then you, as the designer, would take that and go and iterate on that and produce a mock-up. Then
typically a static mock-up.
Yep. Yeah. So mock-up, for those that aren't aware, like a drawing, essentially a digital drawing.
Yeah, and maybe I'll possibly toot my own horn for a minute, but I actually don't think I did a lot of those mock-ups. This is getting to the theme of the day here, but that was a very common practice. Like I always preferred to design in browser or in
Yes.
whatever, to have that context and that like interaction within the actual, like, essentially using the thing the way that ultimately the user would. But the common practice within the industry, and even still to this day, you know, in a lot of like teams and companies and stuff, like you're actually just producing a static image and passing that off. And there's no, it's maybe multiple static images that represent different small like iterations of like, you know, status or state or whatever within the same piece of that image. So it's just like a little superfluous, a little bit, you know, there has to be a better way kind of a thing, right?
Yeah, well, at the time, it was the best way to do it. And, you know,
Yeah.
you're totally right. Like, if you got a great designer, you would get several essentially static images. Sometimes they'd have redlining and stuff like that. That would have different
Yeah.
states, whatever. Then
That's
as
a
a
good point.
developer,
If you didn't
Yeah.
have a good designer, you might just get one image and have to
You might just get
figure
one,
it out.
right.
Yeah.
yeah. And then I would take it and go and write code to implement it. And inevitably, there would be something that neither of us thought about in the beginning that I'd run into. And it's like, then it's like, I got to schedule a meeting with Ross, so on and so forth, right? But that was, at the time, right? That was the best way to do it and to, like, ensure quality at the end,
Yeah.
right? That was a process that you could put in place, and you could put people in these roles, and out would come relatively decent software. But now, like I said, we're cooking up some new practices, new principles. One of them being retrospective design is sort of what we've called it. And I'll take a crack at it, and then you can jump in because you're the SME on this, subject matter expert.
Sure.
But
yeah.
essentially, what it involves is instead of the designer being the initial like point of that process, you have the developer using an AI code generation tool build the functionality that they need, right? Because always the developer, because they're having to build the nuts and bolts logic, they should always be the most knowledgeable about the business processes, right? So you have the developer build the software or the interface with an AI code generation tool. And, you know, the fidelity these days is pretty good in terms of like, you can ask it to spit out React components, tables, cards, you know, what have you, and do pretty well, tabs. But basically, the developer designs what's essentially like almost a shad CN, like kind of an anemic, functional version of the software. Very not designed up. And then you give it to a designer and you say that Ross told me that I could say this. It's every designer's favorite phrase, make it pretty. Is that accurate, Ross?
Oh yeah. People, well, most people don't know, but that's like, yeah, designers, you either love it or hate it. And if you love it, it's typically because you've heard it so much that it's just funny.
Yep. Yeah, that was a joke.
Yeah.
But then, so then you as a designer get to kind of apply your craft. And the beauty is, you know, it comes with the disclaimer of this is just to show you how the software needs to work, but feel free to rip it all down and rebuild it as long as it still utilizes the same, like, endpoints and things like that.
There's a lot there, and I think I'll just jump back to like the make it pretty thing. Like we joke around that, and I don't know how many designers are actually offended when people tell them that. I mean, obviously, it's like the reason for the like any sort of like disgruntledness around that phrase is more because typically when you hear that, it's like, you know, you've been either in some sort of project or at an organization working on something X, Y, or Z where design was treated as an afterthought. And like, you know, some of this jumps back to like the very first question about like, what is design? I mean, it's like, I think the more important part that like we sort of glossed over within the process of this kind of like hypothetical here where we're working on some sort of coffee subscription, you know, sign up experience. It's that like kickoff meeting to know that everyone's in the same room, and like that is where design starts as far as I'm concerned. And I think a lot of designers feel a little bit slighted if you're brought in like further down that like chain, so to speak, and you're not like involved in that kickoff process, because again, design starts from just like the thinking around like what is the problem we're trying to solve, and like the fastest, most efficient means to that end with what we've have in front of us as far as tools, like in this present day and age. And so to flip that on its head, I think the way it works where we're talking about this like retroactive design, where it's like the developer's just kind of like going for it and kind of trying to solve and then bringing the designer in, that works because there are tools out there now that like enable the developer to kind of spin that up without like exhausting like, weeks or months or whatever, trying to, just losing and wasting time. But also you have to have, and I think this is something that like we're very fortunate to have, is like that like trust in that relationship between that designer and developer to know, and I said this, I think, to you recently, make sure those headphones stay on because I'm going to maybe inflate your head a little bit here. It's rare to find a developer that does have some of that design thinking out the box, so to speak. What I think is the most interesting about this is that these tools that are now allowing developers to kind of like rapidly iterate and build some of these experiences themselves, is it's forcing, you could tell me if I'm wrong, but I think it's forcing developers to like have more of that design thinking.
Absolutely.
Like out of the, like just like from the process of going through that. Cause that's all stuff that like, typically in the previous example where we're getting static mockups, like that's stuff that I've already as a designer thought through and then given to you to just like execute on. But so, I mean, I guess all this is to say, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you feel differently, but like, I think the best thing to happen to like some of this UX like workflow is the fact that like you now have the tools to rapidly like iterate on those ideas and then bring them to me and I can be like, well, what if this wasn't a form input or whatever here? What if this wasn't a select menu? What if it was, something else? Like, it's so easy for you to go and make that change. And it's not this like huge like back and forth or to do, where you lose another week in the project, that I think that it works because it's forcing us both to kind of think on that same wavelength, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, it is important to like, different types of work, different types of software efforts kind of play out differently when it comes to, how the design fits into it. And that's why like, I don't think I'm quite comfortable like committing yet to the term retrospective design, because I'm not exactly convinced that development, like in terms of functionality development, has to happen first for this to be a useful kind of paradigm. Because, as you talk about rapid iteration, the other thing that's happening is, as you're working on it, like you are also able to interact with an AI and essentially do like what every designer actually craves to do, which is design in browser really fast.
Yep.
Because that's ultimately like what you're doing. Like as a designer, you're coming up with, I have an idea. I want to like evaluate that idea and see if there's anything there. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. It's not actually about putting the lines to like, picking the margins and the paddings and everything like that. Like you don't care about that. You're just doing that in order to see if your idea like kind of holds water. And so that's something that you can do, in this process as well, is almost at the same time potentially. But
well,
back to my earlier point, I guess.
Yeah.
I think it's important to note that like the type of software that we're building or what this process allows us to build is it's not just like a CRUD application where it's like a website with form inputs and things like that. Like the type of software that this allows us to build is that which is highly creative to a point where like the interface is almost not known until it's done, because we're using AI in such like creative and novel ways that like we don't really know until we do it what the results are going to be. And so it allows us to do this kind of like, dev spike first to try some like really big things without having a whole bunch of design invested in the front end that might change. But sorry.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's like another, I love my analogies. And I don't know if this is the right one, but I'll just say it anyway. It's like everyone loves the look of like, the big screen TV at Best Buy or whatever when it's in the showroom. But until you get it back in your living room, you don't know if it actually works, like with the space or whatever. And maybe, like I said, that's a little bit of a stretch as far as analogies go. But like all that is kind of like...
You're totally right.
Yeah, like more so to articulate like that to be able to, as much as you possibly can, like design with that full context in mind of like what the outcome is going to be, or what the, like device, or whatever someone's going to be viewing something on is going to be. Like, I don't know, it's just you're removing question marks from the equation that were previously there and could possibly lead to wasted time or whatever. And I think that the smartest thing you can do is just try and like shoot for the stars as early on as you can, and then that you're even just further there if you don't land there directly.
Yeah. I know that like you and I are both pretty big fans of kind of the design ethos that came out of Apple. And like, there's a reason that they had a prototype lab with 50 foam prototypes of the Mac.
Yes.
And I think that is something that like, and the reason is like they wanted Steve Jobs and Johnny Ive, they wanted to see it not just in a drawing, but they wanted to see it in like a physical way. It would cast shadows, and it would be scale of what you would actually be looking at. And like, I think that's kind of the opportunity too that we have with software now, right? It's like so many times, a decision gets made in that kickoff meeting that's like 1 hour long or 90 minutes or whatever.
Yep.
And it's like it gets made just because it gets made, right? Because humans have other things going on in their schedules and whatever. Like that's what you do at meetings, is you make the decision, and then it is what it is, and like you can't ever branch off from that and try things. And it's like, I wonder how many kind of great products could have been if like basically you never had to not try out an alternative. Like
if you could exhaust all options.
Yes.
And you weren't constrained by time or budget or any of the other things of, your coworkers got to go, drop their kids off at school or take them to practice or something. Like, yeah, I mean, I think obviously like that's why we've both aligned with that, is just because it's like it represents this ideal that like, I mean, I'm an idealist, I think. I don't know about you, or if you would identify as that. And we've talked about this too, in terms of like giving yourself that time and space to have the like, because not every idea is a home run right away anyway. So you need to have some of that time and space to be able to like iterate through some of the stuff that just doesn't work, or throw out those bad ideas, right? But I think there's also something that like a lot of great people or companies with like really good design thinking around them do is they hire people that are smart enough to think through things in a way where it's like, I promise there's an end to this. Thought. But it's like, I'm trying to remember what we talked about. I remember we talked about this in the old market, and it was like more just like the idea that like, well, why would it be any other way? Like for like those like solutions that your new designs or paradigms that like we experience the world through, whether it's software, hardware, or anything, outside of that, like just the concept of just like having the time and space and like resources available to like realize that ideal of like, well, yeah, this is it, because why else would it? Why wouldn't it be this?
I think that you're 100% right. It's like the greats in terms of design, Steve Jobs, among them.
Johnny Ive.
Like a lot of people, Elon to an extent, like gotta
Big
look
time.
at the man's track record. Like a lot of people, it's easy to kind of like dismiss and say that like their brain just works different, and they can just look at something and come up with, this is the correct answer. And it's half true. Like their brains are built different, but it's not that they can just magically look at a problem and they are just like, Steve Jobs sits down and draws out the iPhone and that's it. It's like, no, their brains work different because they have literally examined it from every possible angle in every single scenario, where they've drawn out every single option or built every single prototype. And it's like that it seems to be an arrogant statement of saying like, my design is correct, right? There's no other way to do it. But nobody questioned Edison right? When his light bulb went on with his 10,000th filament, material, and he's like, "This is it," right? And it's functionally the same thing, but it's not a physical light bulb. It's like an idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the same thing can happen. It's like 10,000 hours. Right?
Yeah. No, that was really clever. I don't know if you intended that or not with the light bulb and the idea.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's like, yeah, it's just you become an expert eventually.
Yeah.
You
I think
look at a problem long enough.
And that's, not to delve too deep into like the public perception of like the Elons of the world, or et cetera. But I think that's also like therein lies kind of some of the challenge of someone, or, a person or a company or whoever that has like created said thing that is so obviously amazing and like, could never be imagined any other way. They've already gone through all that like work or whatever it is that has arrived at that place, that then you present it to the world and it seems so like novel, and people will possibly question it, or like, but depending on how, iterative or revolutionary it is, you have people that are just going to have their opinions no matter what. And for someone who is bringing that to the table or to the world and has had all that like background and context about like the thought process that arrived wherever it is that it arrived, there's almost like a level of like, I think you said something around like it being like kind of like pretentious or conceited, because it's like they're bringing this and no one else has that context that they do. Mm-hmm. And so in their eyes, it's like, this is the obvious solution and here's why. And when people maybe don't get it right away, or, whatever, because change and, adopting new technologies can be difficult for some, it's like, yeah, I don't know. It's hard to
it's
like challenge you. Yeah, like the guy's just like, well, duh, this is it.
There's countless examples of like back in the day when we were figuring out like how atoms worked and stuff. Like, we didn't know, and people had different theories. Like there's countless examples of dudes who like solved it, and they were like, yes, this is correct, and like here's my math, and people just didn't understand, and like until after they died, like they were long dead before people were like, oh yeah, that guy actually had it right. We should have listened to him.
Like all great artists, that's a saying for a reason, for sure. But yeah, so I mean, I don't know how you want to connect this all back, to put a bow on like the tooling around, software development and the design that therein lies within that. I think it's like anything, like it's going to take time for people to really feel comfortable using these tools without seeing them as a replacement for, like the light bulb, for instance. If we're going back to Edison, it's like, this is an amazing thing, and people eventually saw that. But I bet there was one dude who was selling candles to people who was like, fuck, this, damn that thing, and it took him a little bit.
It can't, that, and it's not even that. It's like, there's like almost a denial sort of like, that's like, no, that can't work. That will you're going to stretch wires to everybody's house. Are you crazy?
Yeah, exactly.
That is not a thing.
So, it's just like getting people to see the utility in it, and that it ultimately, this type of thinking is going to be a feature, not a bug, for lack of a better way of saying it. I don't know. It just takes time and repetition. And as with all things, you just like, the more you can use these tools for your advantage, the more you'll realize that boost of productivity or power or whatever you want to call it. And it's kind of a snowball effect from there.
Yeah,
it just takes that like curiosity to get started,
Yeah. And it speaks a lot to like kind of our decision in our initial, foray target market, that being primarily startups and entrepreneurs, because like, there's no ego. And that's what I love about like founders. Mm-hmm. They're just grinders. They just want to get the results. And so like they'll try whatever. They're not entrenched in like these traditional like, well, we have to do things this way and we have to have these meetings and we need to follow this process that's documented. They're just like, I think that you're right, that you could do this about 10 times faster than these other guys, so let's go. And I love that. And like anyone who's building innovative technologies, if you can find a customer segment that just wants results and they don't care about the way that it's supposed to be done, like those are the folks to start with, because it's awesome.
Yeah. It's just like a results driven mindset, Dig that. That's good.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on, Ross. I think we're coming to the end of time, and apparently my internet might be coming to the end of time. So.
Oh, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm really excited for kind of the world that we're going to be living in. You know, as companies like us bring tools to market to really, you know, upfit the creatives of the world, and there will be other tools as well. And there are I'm just excited to live in a world with 10 times better software anytime that I touch a piece of software, whether it's
I mean, you know, it's kind of going back to I mentioned earlier, the sort of exponential nature of just all the creative tools that we've had, you know, to use in our tool belt, since the internet, essentially. You know, I love the idea of a world where part of that growth is, and then maybe a huge part of that growth is just giving people the tools to build whatever tools they need. And, you know, ultimately it's we've talked about the idea this before, is if you can dream it, you can build it. You know, what are the next steps of that sort of ideology?
Well, I'm stoked to be doing it with you, man.
Yeah, likewise. Anytime you want to jam on this is, I love this stuff. So you know where to find me. And let's keep going.
Folks following the CodeBuddy journey and brand, if you don't like anything, please email Ross at CodeBuddy.com.
Yeah, you can yell at me.
Phone number is no.
Yeah. Hey, I'm still a proud 402. I'll give you the area code at least.
I'm not, actually. I'm a native Iwegian.
No way?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. That's crazy. Dang.
All right.
Well.
We'll catch you next week, folks. Thanks for sticking around.
Cheers.